The rain had been falling for 3 days straight. Somewhere in the Montana wilderness, a mare was struggling through the mud with 3 newborn foals. The storm was relentless. The night was getting colder, and by the time she reached the only light she could see through the darkness, she had already lost one. She had one chance, one gate, one rancher who almost missed her in the rain. If you've ever believed that hope finds us in our darkest moments, this story will prove you right. Make sure you hit like and subscribe before we begin, because this one is going to stay with you. Drop your country in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching from. Thomas Briggs had been watching the rain for 3 days. It wasn't unusual for April in Montana. Spring storms had a way of settling into the valley and refusing to leave, turning dirt roads to rivers and pastures to lakes. But this one was different, heavier, more persistent, the kind of rain that made a man grateful for a solid roof and worry about everything beneath it. Thomas was 57 years old and had spent his entire life on the same 200 acres his grandfather had homesteaded in 1947. He raised quarter horses mostly, along with a small herd of cattle that kept him company and kept him humble. He had buried his wife 6 years earlier and his last working dog 3 months ago. Now it was just him, 12 horses in the main barn, and the sound of rain on a tin roof that had started to feel less like weather and more like loneliness. He made his final rounds at 9:30 that evening, checking the barn doors, counting heads, making sure the drainage ditches were holding. The rain was coming down in sheets, so thick he could barely see past the fence line. Lightning split the sky every few minutes, illuminating the valley in brief flashes of white before plunging it back into darkness. Thomas was walking back toward the house when he heard it. Not thunder, not the rain, something else. A sound that didn't belong, high and desperate and barely audible over the storm. He stopped and turned, straining to hear it again. There, faint but unmistakable, the cry of a horse in distress. Thomas grabbed his flashlight and his coat and headed toward the front gate. What he found there made his heart drop. A chestnut mare stood just outside the gate, her body swaying with exhaustion. Her coat so soaked it clung to her ribs like skin. She was a Mustang, wild-born by the look of her, with the lean build and watchful eyes of a horse that had never known a barn or a hand that didn't mean harm. She was young, maybe 4 years old, but she looked ancient in that moment. Used up, at the very edge of what her body could survive. But she wasn't alone. Pressed against her sides, struggling to stand in the mud, were 2 foals. Newborns, their legs trembling, their coats plastered flat, their small bodies shaking from cold and exhaustion. The mare was trying to shelter them with her body, shifting her weight to block the worst of the rain, nuzzling them upright every time they started to sink into the mud. Thomas understood immediately. She had given birth in the storm. Somewhere out in the wilderness, alone, she had brought 3 lives into the world during the worst weather Montana had seen in months. He looked at the mare. Then he looked past her, scanning the darkness with his flashlight, searching for the 3rd foal he knew had to be out there somewhere. He found it 30 yards down the fence line. A tiny paint foal, barely an hour old, lying motionless in the mud where it had collapsed. The mare had tried to bring it with her. Thomas could see the drag marks in the earth where she had nudged and pushed and refused to leave it behind. But the foal had been too weak, too cold, and the storm had taken it before she could get it to safety. Thomas knelt in the rain beside the small body and placed his hand against its neck. Still warm, but gone. He stayed there for a long moment, rain running down his face, his hand resting on the foal that would never stand. Then he rose and walked back to the gate where the mare was waiting. She watched him approach with eyes that held exhaustion and grief and a flicker of something else. Something that looked like the last fragile thread of hope that hadn't broken yet. Thomas opened the gate. The mare didn't move at first. She stood there in the rain, assessing him, deciding whether this man was safety or just another danger in a world that had already taken too much from her. Thomas didn't rush her. He stepped back and held the gate open and waited. One of the foals took a shaky step forward, then another. The mare followed, keeping her body between Thomas and her babies, moving slowly through the gate and into the ranch yard. Thomas closed the gate behind them and led the way to the nearest shelter, an equipment barn with an open front and dry ground. The mare followed him inside and stopped in the center of the space, her sides heaving, her head low. The two foals collapsed immediately, their legs folding beneath them, too exhausted to stand any longer. Thomas moved carefully. He brought warm water and clean towels. He dried the foals first, rubbing them down with slow, gentle strokes until their coats began to fluff and their shivering eased. He checked their mouths, their breathing, their small hooves caked with mud. Both were weak but alive. Both would survive if he could keep them warm and dry through the night. Then he turned to the mare. She was watching him still, that steady gaze that seemed to be measuring him, deciding how much trust to give. Thomas approached her slowly, talking in the low, quiet voice he had used with horses his entire life. Not words that mattered. Just tone, just presence, just the promise that he meant no harm. He cleaned the cuts on her legs where she had pushed through barbed wire or thorns. He checked her hooves, picked out the stones and debris, felt for heat or swelling. He brought her grain mixed with warm water and held the bucket while she ate, too tired to lower her head all the way to the ground. When he was finished, he stepped back and looked at the three of them together. The exhausted mare. The two sleeping foals curled against each other in the dry straw. In the empty space where the third should have been, Thomas made a decision. He went back out into the rain. He walked to where the paint foal lay in the mud and lifted it carefully, cradling the small body against his chest. It weighed almost nothing. He carried it back to the equipment barn and laid it gently in the straw beside the two living foals. The mare turned and looked at it. She lowered her head and touched her nose to the foal's wet coat, breathing in its scent one last time. She stood like that for a long moment, motionless except for the rise and fall of her breathing. Then she turned away and nuzzled the two foals that were still breathing. Thomas watched her choose life over grief. Watched her decide, in whatever way horses decide these things, that the two she could save mattered more than the one she couldn't. He stayed in the barn with them through the night. He brought blankets and a thermos of coffee and settled into a corner where he could keep watch without crowding them. The mare never fully slept. She dozed standing, her head dipping low before jerking back up, checking her foals, checking Thomas, checking the storm still raging beyond the barn's open front. By dawn, the rain had softened to a steady drizzle. Thomas rose stiffly and went to check on the foals. Both were standing now, nursing, their small tails flicking with the tentative energy of new life that had decided to keep going. He buried the paint foal that morning in a corner of the pasture where wildflowers grew thick in summer. He didn't know if it mattered to the mare, but it mattered to him. Every life that came through his gate, even the ones that didn't stay, deserved that much. Over the following days, Thomas worked to earn the mare's full trust. He brought her food and water 3 times a day. He cleaned her wounds and checked her foals and never moved faster than she was comfortable with. He talked to her constantly, that same low, steady voice, until she began to recognize the sound of his footsteps and turn toward him instead of away. He started calling her Rain. It seemed right. She had come to him through the storm, carrying life and loss in equal measure, and somehow both had made her stronger rather than broken. By the end of the first week, Rain was allowing him to touch her neck without flinching. By the end of the second week, she was following him from the equipment barn to the main pasture, her 2 foals trotting beside her on legs that grew steadier each day. Thomas named the foals Dawn and Ember. Dawn for the pale gray filly who had been born into darkness and survived to see morning. Ember for the bright chestnut colt whose spirit seemed too large for his small body. A local veterinarian named Dr. Sarah Chun came out to the ranch 2 weeks after the storm to check on the horses. She examined Rain thoroughly, checking for any lingering complications from a birth, and pronounced her healthy and recovering well. She examined the foals and smiled at their energy and curiosity. As she was packing her equipment, Sarah asked Thomas what he planned to do with them. Thomas looked out at the pasture where Rain was grazing with Dawn and Ember never more than a few feet from her sides. He thought about the night he had found them at his gate. He thought about the empty space where the third foal should have been and the choice Rain had made to keep going anyway. He told Sarah he planned to keep them. Sarah nodded slowly. She told him that Rain was lucky to have found him that night. Thomas shook his head and said he figured it was probably the other way around. Rain and her foals stayed. They became part of the rhythm of the ranch, part of the landscape Thomas saw every morning when he stepped onto his porch with his first cup of coffee. He watched Dawn and Ember grow from uncertain foals into strong yearlings. He watched Rain go from a wild, frightened Mustang to a horse who nickered when she saw him coming and followed him around the pasture like a large, curious dog. He gentled her slowly over the months that followed, using patience instead of force, trust instead of dominance. By the time autumn arrived, Rain was wearing a halter and leading beside him without a rope. By winter, she was accepting a saddle. By the following spring, Thomas was riding her through the valley where she had been born, her foals grown tall and confident running alongside them. The loneliness that had filled the house after his wife died and his dog passed began to feel different. Not gone, but shared. Rain seemed to understand it in the way animals sometimes do. She would stand at the fence near the house in the evenings, watching him move past the windows, waiting for him to come out and sit with her in the last light of day. Thomas started talking to her the way he used to talk to his wife. About the weather, about the horses, about nothing in particular. Rain would stand with her head over the fence, her ears forward, listening to every word. One year after the night Rain had appeared at his gate, Thomas stood in the same spot and looked out at the ranch. Rain was in the near pasture with Dawn and Ember, all three of them sleek and healthy and completely at home. The spring grass was coming green. The sky was clear. He thought about the paint foal buried under the wildflowers. He thought about how loss and life had arrived together that night, inseparable, two sides of the same storm. He thought about how Rain had chosen to keep walking even after she lost one, how she had found his gate in the darkness and trusted him enough to step through it. He had saved her that night, but standing there in the clear, spring morning, watching her graze peacefully with the foal she had fought so hard to protect, Thomas understood that she had saved him too. The ranch wasn't empty anymore. The silence wasn't lonely. And the rain, when it came, was just weather again. Nothing more, nothing less. Just life continuing the way it always had, the way it always would. Thomas didn't open that gate expecting anything in return. He opened it because something needed him to, and because of that one decision made in the pouring rain, Rain and her two foals survived, found a home, and gave one lonely rancher a reason to keep going. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. And drop a comment below. What would you have done in Thomas's place?